Hey everyone, it's Reed. Before we get started, I want you to go to sez.us, that's SEZ.us, and join me, Joe Trippi, and so many others in building the social network for the sane. Guys, it's time to give up on Elon and Mark and get to a place where we can have the discussions we want to have about politics, news, sports, whatever it is. Right now, go to sez.us, SEZ.us, and help us build this community, build the sane community on social media. And now, on with the show. Welcome back to the home front. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm joined by longtime attorney and pro-democracy activist, George Conway. George is the president of the Society for the Rule of Law, a fellow co-founder of the Lincoln Project, a contributor to The Atlantic, and host of the Bulwark podcast, George Conway Explains It All. He's also the president and executive director of the Anti-Psychopath PAC, a PAC dedicated to highlighting Donald Trump's mental instability and bringing it to the forefront of national discussion. I'm sorry we even still need that. Today, he is coming to us from just outside of Washington, D.C. George, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Reed. Always a pleasure.
So, George, you and I talked this summer about the Anti-Psychopath PAC, and it's amazing. I was telling some folks in New York City this week, we're 9.5 years into Donald Trump coming down the escalator. And not one day has been better than the last in that almost decade of what Jeff Sharlet calls the Trumpocene era. And so now here we are inside of 2 weeks before Election Day, and it's still too close to call. And so from your perspective, if you would give everybody a sense of what Donald Trump 3.0 looks like in office, because as Ezra Klein mentioned on his podcast this morning, the quote unquote guardrails, and I use that term advisedly, that were around him from 2017 to 2021 are now gone forever. And the people replacing those, the Committee to Save the World or whatever they called themselves, are actively looking to do all they can, both on his behalf, for themselves, and against, frankly, people like you and me.
Right. No, and look, these people, these narcissistic sociopaths like Trump, malignant narcissists, you call them psychopaths, whatever you want to call them, dictator types, cult leaders, they always get worse. They always get worse because they become more aggrieved over time, and they have declining mental faculties over time. And over time, if they become successful, there are fewer constraints on them. And that's what you're seeing with Donald Trump. I mean, we saw how he busted through guardrails during his first term, and it got worse over time as people rolled over and left. People rolled over, I mean, literally, not just transferring out of the administration, but just rolling over and just saying, well, it's not worth fighting him. And, the people who were there at the beginning of the administration weren't there at the end of the administration. And the very few of them left who were at the Justice Department, who basically stood up to the guy and said, no, we're not going to allow you to use the Justice Department to commit your acts of insurrection, in essence. Those people who stood up and threatened to resign en masse, they're not going to be there in the next administration. And, they're doing their best to make sure that the people who go into the next administration are, they're going to do their best to make sure that they're loyal to one man and not to the rule of law and not to the Constitution. And then, that's one aspect of it. And those are an important part of the guardrails. Because law isn't self-executing. It requires processes. It requires people to obey the law in the first instance, and then it requires people to prosecute and to bring lawsuits and for judges to fairly decide. And he's gonna the first line of defense is going to be people saying you can't do that. He's just not going. He's going to blow right through them. And the second line of defense will be people being prosecuted, and he's going to stop people from being prosecuted for violating the law. And he has his own little protection that the Supreme Court gave him this year. And then there's the other fact that basically he's gotten more aggrieved, more psychologically he's deteriorated. And I'm not talking about his cognitive abilities yet. I will get there. But, his psychological state is much, much worse now. He is much, much more aggrieved because he basically has run up against the system and tried to roll over it, tried to basically say that the rules don't apply to me, they apply to everyone else. And he's gotten indicted for it and prosecuted and convicted for it. And he's much, much more aggrieved a human being at the forces of law and order and decency and honor that have lined up against him. And he wants to destroy them all. Now, that's what his main goal is. And that's the main goal at the end of a lot of narcissistic sociopaths. And he believes, as he believed during his first term when he talked about my generals and talked about, him having Article 2 powers that he can do anything, under which he could do anything he wants. He's going to take that and he's going to double, triple, quadruple down on that this time because he's going to view the government, as he tried on various occasions during his first term in office, as an instrument of personal revenge. Because everything is personal to him. Everything is about him. Everything is about his egos. Every ego is not about the public, not about the public interest, not about the public trust, not about his duties to the country, not about honor, not about anything, not about the rule of law, not about the Constitution he's going to swear to uphold. And that he almost broke on January 6, 2021.
And so, George, here we are again, almost 4 years past the last election he lost fair and square.
And the last insurrection.
And the last insurrection that he was responsible for. And, you saw, talking about rolling over, Mitch McConnell, in a magazine interview said, oh, yeah, absolutely, Donald Trump's responsible for it. Of course, my guess is if he had wanted to, he probably could have mustered the 17 votes to make sure Donald Trump
And he said that on February 13, 2021, right after the trial, the impeachment trial was gavelled to a close. He basically said, there's a criminal law that can deal with this guy. He thought he could just fob this off to the criminal justice system and absolve himself of political responsibility, and responsibility to the Constitution to see that this man, in accordance with the Constitution, which provides for this as a sanction, that never holds public office again for violating his oath of office. And, he punted on that because he thought he didn't need it. He thought the guy would just go away. Well, sorry, Mitch. And we are all sorry for it.
And so, George, let me rely on your legal expertise for a moment. And you mentioned the Supreme Court decision this past summer that basically said that Donald Trump couldn't be prosecuted for anything he had done in office that was, quote unquote, an official act.
Right.
So fast forward to January 21st, 2025. How much kind of coverage does that give someone like him and the people working for him? Because, I did a lot of these simulations with very dedicated people across the aisle for the Brennan Center and other groups. And, the first thing, and this was before the court's decision, and, we're going to file lawsuits, we're going to do this. And I always thought, that's the normal world in which we would usually operate, but that's not the normal world anymore. So give us a sense of just how expansive, aside from executive power on its own anyway, that a decision like that gives a guy like Trump.
Well, it's interesting because it's not necessarily sufficiently expansive to defeat the charges that have now been brought against him. But of course, if he is elected president, then the Justice Department longstanding rule and interpreting the Constitution that says that you can't prosecute a president while he's in office would come into play, and they'd automatically kick the case. But what about? Trump is. It's worse than that he has immunity for official acts. What he did on January 6th was not official mostly. His immunity for official acts not only gives him license to use his powers to violate the law, it actually creates a perverse incentive for him to do that. And when Richard Nixon wanted to get something done that was illegal, or at least his people, they had this private operation that they used.
Plumbers.
The plumbers, right? Ex-CIA agents, secret bundles of cash, and so on and so forth. Under the Supreme Court's decision this year, no president who wanted to be corrupt and wanted to do illegal things would do it that way. He'd use the actual members of his government, because that confers on him official immunity. So the plumbers would have been all on the White House payroll in the Nixon administration if Nixon had known what he was doing and had this Supreme Court, right? He would have absolutely, he would have done nothing he would have used government, he would use the United States Treasury to pay off the burglars, okay? Direct the U.S. Treasury to pay this guy's legal bills and to send him off to another country and to buy off his silence. If he used he used them and told it to be the Secretary of the Treasury or the head of the IRS to say, just make it a tax refund. Make it a phony tax refund. Under the Supreme Court's decision, hey, he's exercising his official powers, arguably. So it's worse. It's actually it's worse than some people make it out to be. He's got an incentive now to abuse the government, and that's one of the many reasons why the Supreme Court's decision was for the parts that unnecessarily so, because they decided the next 5 cases instead of deciding just the one that was before them. But that's why the Supreme Court's decision is just so perverse.
Right. So you mentioned that. I mean, there was a story, I think, out maybe earlier this week or late last week about Eileen Cannon, the federal judge who was, I believe, deemed unqualified by the American Bar Association when she was nominated.
I'll deem her. All
right. Yeah. By the Conway Bar Association.
Yeah, the Conway Bar Association.
Yeah, unqualified for the job, but that she has effectively dismissed the charges against him for the classified documents case, but that she might be on the short list for Attorney General. I mean, that doesn't surprise me at all.
No, it doesn't. I mean, because they are looking for people who will be loyal more to him than they are to the law and to the Constitution and to their oaths of office. And I think to their satisfaction, she fits that bill. And, and nothing, Trump is nothing if not transactional. He's going to want to reward this woman for all that she has tried to do to help him. And, she's thoroughly unqualified to be Attorney General. She's not even qualified to be a federal judge. She's not a very good federal judge. But, we saw this in the first administration, the first Trump administration, and we'll absolutely see it to a higher order of magnitude in a second Trump administration, should one come to pass, God forbid. We are going to see more and more incompetent people, but people of questionable judgment and honor, failing upward to positions of high authority.
Which is not unusual amongst authoritarian regimes.
Correct.
Because oftentimes they're the only people who are willing to do anything and everything to both get those jobs, stay in those jobs, and advance.
We're incapable of getting the jobs in a normal environment. Absolutely.
Right.
It's well documented.
And so let me zoom back into the next couple of weeks. So here we are, again, less than 2 weeks before Election Day. I've said repeatedly to the listeners, George, that, we really have 2 phases of the campaign between this moment and when the polls close, and when the polls close to when the next president is inaugurated on January 20th. And so what do you see in your experience, both as an attorney, as a student of Trumpism who's been as close as anybody to it? What worries you about that immediate, aftermath of the polls closing? Is it and let me just, as an aside, say this. All of these interviews about, what Trump's going to do, they all start with not whether or not Trump will declare victory, but what time he's going to declare victory, whether or not he's lost. 9 p.m., 10 p.m., 11 p.m. I mean, that in and of itself, it beggars the belief that, more people aren't ringing alarm bells, but I guess maybe here we are.
Yeah, because this is one of the things that Trump has done to our country, is that he has created this alternative reality of alternative normalcy, this malignant, what psychologists and sociologists would call malignant normality, where the absolutely depraved becomes normal. And that's, he will never, ever accept defeat. He will blame it on somebody else, whether it be the Jews or the people who are, operating, running, counting voting machines or whoever. He will make up whatever he can, and has no compunction about whether it's true or false, whether it foments violence, whether it's good for the country, whether it even, it's not even going to be whether it helps him or not, because he's going to be wanting to basically bring the entire system down if he can't run it. Because, he's not just running for president this year. He's running from prison.
Right. Now, let me ask you this. The people around him, not the same. I mean, some of them are the same people. Some of them, I think, are much smarter. I think also, too, that too many people see, the red guys and, the guys in the red MAGA hats and think that this isn't a dangerous movement. And I think it is a movement. And so a lot of the people, like, they're in on this, right? Like, they know, oh, yeah, like, in 2020, they were like, Mr. President, you've lost. You're likely to lose. You shouldn't do these things. And they were eventually rolled over or kicked out. But now, George, my guess is you can't be in Mar-a-Lago, the campaign, the RNC, or any of the other Trumpist organs without knowing that he's going to say, I've won, whether it's true or not. And they're going along with it, too.
Absolutely. I mean, you can, he's basically been saying, if you are willing to support and assist and work for and make a living off of a candidate who has claimed that insisted that the last election was stolen when in fact it was not. I mean, you've already crossed that moral boundary. And there's going to be nobody on the Trump side to say, oh, you can't do this. They know he's already done it. No one's going to be surprised. I think the only thing that will be limiting him is the very good work of a friend of mine who formed this group called the 65 Project. And the 65 Project is a nonprofit group that has filed bar complaints against the lawyers who prosecuted many of the frivolous post-election lawsuits in 2020 and early 2021. And quite a number of them have been disciplined or even disbarred. And so I think it's going to be tougher to some extent to find good litigators to pursue all of these claims. But on the other hand, we've seen he somehow manages to cause all sorts of people, including lawyers, to risk and at times sabotage and destroy their own reputations and livelihoods in order to serve him because they have some kind of ambition or some desire to be in the mix or some financial incentive or whatnot. I mean, look at poor Rudy Giuliani, who basically had his apartment taken away this week.
I know. And I hope that Shay and Miss Ruby, before they sell it for however much money they're going to make from it.
Yeah, I hope they throw a party. And in fact, I contribute to that.
Yeah, exactly. I hope they have one hell of a bash in Rudy's apartment in New York City before they sell
I keep thinking of the song, moving. Remember the song, the theme song of the Jeffersons, moving on up to the east side, deluxe apartment in the sky. Time to party. I love it.
I agree. And certainly karma has come back to bite him as well. It should. And so let's talk about that, the legal stuff, because in 2020, George, he was in the White House, so he had a lot of authority that he didn't use. But it seemed a lot of it, too, was ad hoc, that they were sort of making it up as they went along. From both a legal basis and a political basis, they've had now years to work on this stuff. So do you have any concern that the whatever BS lawyer plans they have out there, legal plans they have out there, could create enough of the sand in the gears or dust in the air to generate the kind of confusion that really is what they're looking for, to say, well, how could anybody know who really won?
Yeah, there are so many lawsuits already.
Yeah.
Extant. I can't keep track of them all, and I don't think I have the time to. I mean, I actually was on this podcast very recently, Mark Elias,
sure,
who does all the litigation for the DNC and is just a fabulous lawyer. I know he's now, considered to be one of the people at the top of the list to go to Guantanamo, even before us. But he, they're bringing all sorts of lawsuits and they're doing all sorts of things throughout the country to basically try to eliminate votes.
Yeah.
They had a bunch of litigation, which I think they lost just last night or the day before, in Pennsylvania, where they're basically trying to get the courts of Pennsylvania to say that if you up your mail-in ballot, you have to have the security envelope or the 2 envelopes, and you have to sign whatever in a certain way, and it's for security purposes and whatnot, that if you screw that up, what happened 4 years ago is, depending on the county clerk would call you up and say, Mr. Galen, we have your ballot that you mailed in the other day. You'd put your birth date on instead of the date of the issue. You have to fix this or else we can't count it.
It's called curing your ballot.
It's called curing. And what you can do is you can either resubmit, or I think you can submit a provisional ballot. And they tried to make it so that the county clerks did not have an obligation or barred, I don't know which, but from making the notifications to voters to allow them to cure and to execute provisional ballots. Fortunately, in a very close decision, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania rejected that argument. But, that could make the difference in, a few 10,000, 20,000 votes. I forget, there was some significant tens of thousands of votes could have been invalidated on that grounds. And that could be, in a close race, that could be more than enough to tip the balance. They're moving to strike people from voter rolls in various states. I heard there was this massive effort they did in Oklahoma. Why Oklahoma? I have no idea.
Right.
And
because they can.
Yeah, and they also brought some meritless lawsuits to try to keep people who live abroad, who have the absolute right to vote as American citizens in the jurisdiction to which they consider themselves ultimately resident. Right? If you live in France for a couple of years and you intend to move back to Utah, you get to vote in Utah as long as you're an American citizen. And, they tried to stop that. They tried to put in, they tried to say that was potential for fraud with that. It's like, there's never had that problem. People have been doing that. People have been voting absentee, and particularly in the military, since 1864.
Right.
And it's just crazy what the lengths to which that they will try to invalidate votes. And, it says to me something that if you're trying to throw out votes, just sort of en masse, you're not on the side of democracy. Okay, if you're legit trying to throw out fraudulent votes, that's one thing. But they just aren't. It's a fiction that there are these massive troves of fraudulent votes. It's a lie. We've learned that now repeatedly. They know that, and so now they're just trying to use technicalities, to basically deprive people of the right to vote, and not just technicalities. They're just trying to use any bullshit argument they can come up with to try to keep people from exercising their right to vote, because they know that the more people who vote, the more likely it is they lose.
Right. Because, again, I do think, just from an electoral perspective, George, I think that Harris and Walz have more voters available to them.
Right. That's right.
In these places. Right. It's now a matter of making sure that those voters
they show
turn
up
out.
And right. And he's hit a ceiling, and that's his problem.
And his ceiling and that's why you've also seen, whether or not it started with No Labels or Jill Stein or Bobby Kennedy, right? Like
they do anything. They do anything to even the score by cutting into the other, lowering the ceiling for the other side. Absolutely.
Right. And so, George, in this last couple of weeks, what are you going to be doing? What are you going to be focused on?
Well, my PAC has basically launched its last salvo today. I've been starting to tweet about it all day, and basically it's our kind of look. I formed this PAC that basically was designed to point out the psychological issues, because I think if you understand those, you understand Trump. I think they explain everything. I think the mass media's failure to talk about Trump in pathological terms has effectively normalized him, when in fact he's very easy to understand if you understand that he is a narcissistic sociopath, and you do a little reading about what these people do and what they've done throughout history, and the cult leaders, the dictators, and just generally bad people who have these traits. And so we took out a full page ad today in the New York Times, where 225 psychologists and psychiatrists signed on to a joint statement basically saying why Donald Trump is unfit for office and that he has psychological conditions that render him incapable of executing the duties of the presidency. And we actually have a video ad that we're going to put out, that we are putting out, and we'll run it in, we do our standard Lincoln Project tactic of running them at Mar-a-Lago and Bedminster just for fun. But we're also going to run it elsewhere, including on one of the Sunday shows this weekend. And, I don't think we're going to get that full national discussion I've always pined for, but I think we've made a dent. I think we've created some running room for the campaign to talk about weird and unhinged. And I think we've opened up the discussion some. I don't think we've come to grips, though, with his psychology and why he's a danger. I think just too many people are afraid to talk about it, too many journalists. And there's this thing called the Goldwater rule that has deterred people. Although now, I mean, with these, I think the shrinks have all come to realize, there's a big cost to the nation that they protect, that these trades, the psychologists and the psychiatrists, these trade organizations that basically render these people with expertise mute,
right, and mute
from
yes.
speaking out, and moot, I guess.
Well, also, Barry Goldwater ran for president 60 years ago, so once in a while, it's probably due for a renewal.
And they fixed some of the other problems, but I mean that's a long story. I'm doing a shrink broadcast later in the day. People can watch that.
Okay, one last thing before I let you go. So Trump loses in 12 days. What happens to the GOP after that? I have an opinion, but I want to hear yours.
My theory about the GOP, if Trump loses, is there ain't going to be much of a GOP left. And a bunch of different reasons. One is he basically dismantled the National Party. He dismantled it, closed its offices in Washington, in effect, fired everybody, rehired some people, moved it down to West Palm Beach, merged it, what's left of the RNC, with his campaign, put his daughter-in-law in charge of it. And what happens to a campaign when it's over and your candidate has lost? Even if your candidate wins sometimes.
Yeah, selling off all the gear and paying bills.
Right. You just see empty desks with strewn about paper and turned off workstations, or even some turned on still, and empty cups of coffee, and everybody's gone. There will be no RNC after this election. No Republican National Party operation. I mean, there'll be a committee in name only, but there's going to be nobody to do anything. And they're going to be starved of money. He's going to try to keep control of it through Lara. Okay. But it's going to be non-functional. And then you've got the state parties. What's going on at the state party level? Well, you've got the super lunatics, the not so super crazy lunatics, the moderately crazy lunatics, and then the general shameless Republican hack Trumpers.
Right.
Right. You have all these groups that are out to basically murder each other, and are murdering each other in places like Michigan and Arizona, and I'm sure many other places. And so I just don't see how you have a functional Republican Party after that. And then you have the problem of you've got all these people who have been absorbing this shit for 4 or 5 years now about conspiracy theories and voter fraud. And, so many of them are convinced Trump lost 2020. I don't see any reason why they're not going to believe the same bullshit in 2024, at least profess to. And, those people are going to be the backbone of any future party on the right. So I don't know how you do anything with that and create something normal out of it. Now, there's going to be some center-right segment that's not going to be a party, consisting of people like you and me and some normies and some never-Trumpers and some people who are kind of quiet, who are going to try to pretend they didn't really, countenance what happened over the last few years. And those people can have some influence because they're
up for grabs.
They're up for grabs, but they're not going to be enough for a political party.
No, and they're not going to be Democrats.
So, and the question is, can anything happen with that? And I'm afraid, I'm sorry to say, I just think that it's going to take 10, 15, maybe 20 years for some, if we get back to normal, which would be for our system, which equilibrates at a two-party system of two one center-left, one center-right party, both of which hopefully want to play by one set of rules that are consistent, are the Constitution and the laws of the United States. I mean, it's going to be a long time before we get to that, because there's a lot of poison that has to be basically squeezed out of the system. And then there's a lot of realignment. I mean, what we've seen over the last few years is a massive realignment already. And it's not even complete. I mean, Trump seems to have consolidated the low information, low fact vote, and along, you're seeing divisions that are more in the electorate, more along the lines of education than less so now race, right. and gender, of course, is going to
right.
be big. I mean, we're seeing a realignment of some sort, and we're seeing the broad scope of it, but it's not over yet.
Look, I 100% agree, and that's why, I think that, I'm not a Republican anymore. I'm not going to be a Democrat. I am exactly, and maybe you and I are both exactly those people, which we are, what are you then? Well, I am not a partisan in the party
context. I'm an American
context.
citizen who votes, for the people who are going to do the less damage. I used to look for the perfect candidates.
Right.
Okay. Like, I wish my candidate were a combination. I want,
right.
I want this one, and I want this one's intellect, and I want this one's temperament, and there's no such thing.
No.
I mean, it's actually a very conservative view, right? I want a government that's not exciting. Okay?
Right. Boring.
I want a government that's going to actually not do a hell of a lot, but focus on a few things. And I want a government that's going to do it's like the Hippocratic Oath. I do the least amount of harm. And that right now, there's only one alternative, because one party wants to basically destroy everything from our the rule of law to our system of alliances worldwide. To it's crazy. It's nihilistic and self-destructive, and yet that's literally the Republican Party these days.
Right. Well, George, thank you so much for joining me right
Thanks
here.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
So where can we find you online? Where can we find information about the Anti-Psychopath PAC?
Okay, yeah, online. I mean, I'm still kind of wedded right now to X/Twitter, although I think after the election, I'm going to go somewhere else. But right now, I'm at GT Conway 3D on Twitter. And the Anti-Psychopath Political Action Committee is at Psychopath 24 on X or Twitter, and also at psychopathpac.org or something like that. You'll find it.
We'll find it. We'll put it in the show notes.
Psychopath PAC.
As always, gang, you can find me on Twitter and TikTok at Reed Galen, on Threads and Instagram at Reed_Galen USA, of course. Also, guys, Substack, The Homefront, and George, don't leave X yet, but guys, go to SEZ.us. Joe Trippi, I, and a bunch of other people are starting a social network for the sane people. So get out there. As always, gang, 12 days to go.
I want to learn more about that.
Don't you worry, George. I'll be right after it. Join the union.us, guys. Get involved. We need your help. We have 3,500 different volunteer opportunities across the country in target states. Wherever it is you live, you can get involved. Please do that. George Conway, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Reed. Always a pleasure.
And everybody else, we'll see you next time.